Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled GDPR, What You Don't Know Can Hurt You. My name is Lucy Buckley, and I'm the online event coordinator here at ISACA. We have a great presentation in store for you thanks to our sponsor, MediaPro. Before we get started, I'd like to go through a few quick tips. You have two audio options. One is to listen over your computer speakers. Two, you may dial in at any time using the numbers and codes listed to the left. Please note, if you dial in, there might be a slight delay as the slides advance. All ISACA members can receive 1 CPE credit for viewing today's webinar. If you're watching this event live, you must complete 3 attendance checkpoints. Simply click OK on the pop-ups that appear on your screen. Click on the Credits tab at the top of the screen to track your checkpoints. If you're watching the on-demand recorded version of this event, your progress is being tracked by the system and you must watch from the beginning to the very end. After completing this webinar, you can receive your CPE certificate by visiting the transcripts page within your My Learning portal. Please remember that it takes 24 hours for the CPE credit to appear in your ISACA profile. We have made a CPE submission aid that goes over these steps in more detail. Click on the Papers tab at the top of the presentation window to learn more or to download a PDF of today's presentation. Our speakers will be conducting a Q&A session towards the end of this event. So if at any point you have a question, please click on the Q&A tab. If at any time you need technical support, please access the Help tab. And finally, if you have any questions about the CPE submission process or suggestions regarding our webinar series, please visit support.isaca.org. And now I'm going to hand it over to Erin Larson from MediaPro, who's helping to moderate. Erin, take it away.
All right, thanks, Lucy. So I am going to introduce our panelists for today's webinar. First up is Veronika Tonry. Veronika Tonry is the president of Privacy Know-How and is an accomplished privacy and IT professional with more than 20 years of experience. Veronika's deep and extensive knowledge and skills were sharpened as she led the global data privacy program for one of the world's largest oil and gas companies, as well as a Fortune 100 global high-tech company. Veronika provides strategic privacy advice to international clients around data protection and privacy program strategy, policies, and procedures to ensure compliance with US, EU, and Asia privacy regulations. Her skill set focuses on risk analysis, strategic solutions, implementation, and training. Next is Harvey Nez. Harvey is a manager GDPR for Capgemini. He has assisted companies in getting compliant with SOX, PCI DSS, HIPAA, FISMA Moderate, NYDFS, Cybersecurity Regulations, Privacy Shield, and now GDPR for 2.5 years. Harvey has previously worked for ExxonMobil and JP Morgan Chase. He gives back to his profession and service capacities and is the co-founder and past president of the Kettle Moraine chapter in Milwaukee and is currently president of the Houston chapter of ISACA. Harvey is preparing a 2-day workshop on GDPR in April in Chicago and is scheduled to give a master class in GDPR at CACS in Chicago. All right, so here is the agenda for today's webinar. We'll be going through GDPR 101, understanding your risks, culture, territorial scope, risk management, GDPR readiness, and lastly, 5 steps to mitigate risk. Now, I will pass it on to Veronika, who will walk through GDPR 101.
Thank you, Erin. This is Veronika Tonry, and I want to extend a welcome from Austin, Texas to all of you and encourage you to submit questions. So at the end, we'll go through the questions so we can make this as interactive as possible. Also, I want to add a little disclaimer here that neither Harvey nor myself are lawyers, so please don't take this as legal advice. If you have any legal questions, ask your legal counsel. This is really to help you understand more about GDPR. So GDPR, also the Global Data Protection Regulation, is going to become effective in 86 days today on May 25th, 2018. And it's replacing the current directive regulation, and that has been in place since 1995. So a lot has happened in the world, and a lot has happened also in the technology space since the directive became effective. And so in November of last year, I went to a conference in Brussels, and one of the keynote speakers, Vera Jourova, she's a justice commissioner. I heard her talk about it, and she really said that there's an ongoing fight between money and the law, and that the law always lags. And she was explaining that really there's a lot of intent of data being monetized, and the law, especially the old regulation, uh, did not keep in context with the new requirements. So that's what the GDPR is for. The GDPR is seeking to return some control to the individuals, whether they're consumers, whether they're customers of yours, or whether they're employees. So with that, trying to give some of the subject rights back to the individual, there's a real emphasis on, one, transparency, so make people understand how the data is being handled, then also give them some rights. So if the data is incorrect, the right to have it corrected, the right to maybe have it erased when it's no longer needed, and then also good security measures for protecting the data. One of the things that's really changing the ballgame with GDPR is that it has a much broader reach than the current regulation. So whereas before it was focused on companies that had operations in the EU, it's now focused on the handling of EU resident data. And that's not just data that you're collecting, but that's also data, emails, data that's being collected on websites. And I've been working for several years now in-house and also in the consulting space, helping companies comply with GDPR. And it's been a difficult road. When I first do the risk analysis and show some of the shortcomings, most companies and their employees are a little overwhelmed, because not only do you need a data inventory that shows you how the data is being handled, you also need procedures to audit this, update this, and really get a good handle of your data handling practices. Breach protocols now require 72-hour notification. And there's a written mandate for employee training that is overseen by a DPO, a data protection officer. Some companies may have to hire an independent individual that oversees the privacy operations. That's the DPO. And, explicit consent mechanisms need to be in place for new data that you're collecting, but also existing data that, you have collected and that you're using. So a lot of work there, and also, the whole supply chain, your vendors, you need to make sure that whoever is handling data on your behalf is compliant with this regulation. So it's a lot of changes coming up with GDPR.
All right. Thank you, Lucy. Oh, sorry, Veronika, So we are on to our first poll question for this webinar. So question is, what aspect of GDPR compliance do you think will be most difficult to obtain? Data handling and auditing, breach notifications, consent and right to erasure, the DPO requirement, or employee training and awareness. So we'll wait about 30 seconds and then we'll close the poll. All right, everybody get your last minute responses in. And let's close the poll and see what the responses are. So it looks like data handling and auditing and consent and right to erasure are the top results of what people think will be most difficult to obtain. Veronika and Harvey, do you have anything you want to say on these answers here?
I would say that.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Veronika.
So that's what I'm seeing too. A lot of work is going towards analyzing the data, inventorying it, and seeing how to handle and audit it. And then the data subject rights, especially integrating that into the existing operations, is taking a lot of time. So these are kind of the answers I was expecting. How about you, Harvey?
Yes, no, I would agree. Yes, thank you. And let me also just say right from the top here, I'm going to give a disclaimer that my statements and opinions do not necessarily reflect those of my employer, Capgemini. I think the right to erasure is going to be interesting. We're always talking about that amongst colleagues. And it involves, first of all, a subject access request. So you can handle that. But when they want to erase the data, it's going to be necessary to have all of the information regarding your data inventory, your data flows, where the data is, the various repositories, if there are more than one, if data minimization is not in place, so that you can erase what is necessary. And then you will always have logs and backups to deal with, but I think that will probably be reasonably handled by the DPA, is my understanding. Back to you, Veronika.
Thank you, Harvey.
All right, so let's get a little bit further into the GDPR. Veronika, can you help us understand the risks associated with the GDPR a little bit more?
Sure, Erin. So why GDPR has been getting so much press and so much attention is really the fines that you're hearing about. They go up as high as 4% or 20 million euro. So 4% of your annual turnover or $20 million, whichever one is higher. So significant increase from what we have been seeing. And, that is just one and probably one of the most impactful risks of GDPR. But it really starts, and I've kind of wanted to put it together as a stepstone. So it can start with a reprimand, meaning you may not give people their data as fast as you should. So there may be a reprimand from a supervisory or authority on individuals complaining about your data handling procedures. It may also be that you have a data protection impact assessment, a DPIA, that has high residual risk, and you may be told to stop using or deleting your data. So there is quite a bit of operational risks that we see with this regulation too, because the suspension of data transfers would be huge for multinational companies where data is being accessed around the globe. You may have outsourcing in India. You may have a customer service center in Thailand. Data is going around the globe, so stop using the data of the EU data would be very impactful. And the next step up that we're seeing is also regulatory audits and supervision, which really is an operational risk that could be very tedious for a company, having to provide the data on an ongoing basis, that just-in-time audits that could happen with the supervision. So a lot of business resources would be diverted to that. And then we have the financial and reputational risk. And I would say that is a lot like a breach, where, you're in the press. It's hitting your bottom line directly by having to pay these fines. And the fines are much, much more significant than they have been in the past. And just as a comparison, I kind of want to let you know that one of the highest fines in 2017 was a $1.4 million fine for Facebook in Spain. And the highest we've seen after that was later in the year that Italy, the Garante, issued to a UK money transfer company, Signe, that was 5.8 million euro. So, significant amounts of money, but nowhere near the, 20 million euro or higher with 4% of your annual turnover. And what we just seen this year is Belgium Belgium fining Facebook 250,000 euro a day, or up to 100 million euro, with a lawsuit that was actually based on in 2015. So there has been a real a change in the approach to fines. And when I went to the conference in Europe, I heard a lot of frustration with the way that data was being handled from U.S. companies. And so the fines are now supposed to signify how important it is to Europe that the data is treated with the way that's being, that the expectations of the individuals are. The other thing is also, these fines, how they're calculated. Not everyone's going to get the highest fine right away, but it's going to depend on a couple of factors. One is going to be how accountable is your organization already? Do you have privacy controls integrated in your operations? Do you have accountability in roles that you have defined? And you have been trying to handle that. And then also, of course, the context of the incident, whether it was a breach or whether it was poor data handling practices. What was the nature of it? What kind of data was involved? How long did it happen? And, did it happen multiple times? So if you go back to the big fine from the Garante last year, that was 50,000 data subjects. And it was much like Wells Fargo, where data transfers of actual money transfers were happening without the knowledge of individuals. So all this will be defining what's happening, what the fines will be like. And, when you're seeing this, it's not just the fines, but it's also all the money you're going to spend on external counsel or internal counsel and the resources that are going to be diverted to this. So GDPR is a whole new ballgame in the risk profile for organizations that handle European data.
All right. Thanks, Veronika. Harvey, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, not at all. Thank you.
All right, great. On to the next slide here. So, why the GDPR now? Why such a severe regulation?
Thank you, Erin. So my understanding from listening to Drucker, reading his material on culture, is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So there is a huge change here. And let me just continue on the culture. I think there's the culture eats strategy for breakfast. There are two takeaways from this. One is that culture will win every time over your strategy, and it will win early. So you're going to have to change your strategy, because this is a huge culture change, to be able to meet the requirements, the extensive requirements of GDPR. And from my interacting with professionals, both U.S. and European privacy professionals, both in the conferences here in the U.S. and one conference internationally, is that the real reason is that in World War II, it was World War II, and it was basically genocide is the reason for the huge culture change to protect race and religion. And so we need to change the culture by changing employees' behavior through the policies and procedures that we provide and by training. And we hear a lot that security and privacy is everybody's job, but it doesn't always turn out that way. When you do polls, I see the highest number I see is generally about 20 or 30% of companies saying that they have achieved that. So one possible way to help achieve that is to empower your managers, your supervisors, by making them an information security and privacy officer. Make them responsible for working with their employees so that they can ensure that they adhere to the critical controls and the policies of your organization, and then to build that into your performance management system. I think that indeed would be a culture change, but I think that's necessary to both be able to comply with GDPR, especially compliance on demand, and also to avoid breaches, which continue to
great. Veronika, is there anything that you want to add to that one?
I just really concur with Harvey's summary of this. When we see breaches, when we see things go wrong, it's usually the people. So making sure you have a privacy-aware culture and you integrate privacy, also privacy by design is a good example, is really, really important for compliance.
All right, great. So now we are on to the next poll question. So question is, how ready do you believe your organization is for the GDPR? Answers being, we're ready, we'll be there by the deadline, we're striving for compliance but not sure how long it will take, or we're going to wait and see how the fines are handed out. So poll is open and we'll wait about 30 seconds and then we'll close the poll. All right, any last minute answers coming in? And let's close the poll and see what the responses are. Okay, it looks like the vast majority are striving for compliance but not sure how long it will take, followed by we'll be there by the deadline. Harvey, Veronika, anything you want to say about these responses?
I want to congratulate the 36% of people who've gone the long way and will be ready by the deadline or already are ready, and really feel for the people that are striving for compliance. And it is a long journey, and it's a journey that will continue to be monitored. What do you think, Harvey?
No, it really will. This is probably going to carry on the next several years, and at this point, for those companies who are not quite yet at compliance, which is probably the majority, just need to make sure you have your good plans in place, have your budget in place, you know, your confirmation or support from your senior management, and just keep rolling on.
Okay, great. On to the next slide here. So let's talk about who is affected by the GDPR.
So as I already mentioned in the 101, the reach of GDPR is much broader than it has been. And I already see in the questions coming up, there's a lot of confusion who is really affected by this. And this really has great considerations for multinationals. So the bottom line is, even if you don't have offices in the EU, if you process data of EU residents or what they call data subjects in the Union, you market or offer goods to them, meaning you could just have a website that's focusing towards the EU, even if you don't collect payment or you're monitoring them, you are part of GDPR, so you're going to have to comply with it. And so it also affects a lot more small and medium-sized businesses. So what I've been seeing in my consulting practices, especially smaller companies, startups and stuff that are offering goods to other companies, they're being asked, are you GDPR compliant? Are you ready? So a much broader effect. And then also what we're seeing is just the broad scope of the definition of personal data. So anything that can directly or indirectly identify an individual. So it's not just the usual ones like the name, address that we see, or the usual EU special category one like race, religion, political opinions, and such. But it's also the indirect ones. So that could be an IP address. That could be a device number. That could be video recordings that you have within your building, or maybe even WebEx recordings. So anything that can really identify. So that's making GDPR compliance much more complex. And the risk risk-based approach is really something that I highly recommend for dealing with GDPR to see how are you affected. Do you have offices in the EU with employees? So yes, you have much broader scope. How much monitoring are you doing of the EU residents? How much of goods and services do you offer? So really trying to have your privacy framework match what the risk is and match how you're affected by GDPR.
All right. Thank you, Veronika. Harvey, is there anything you want to add to this slide?
No, I think that's covered very well. Thank you.
All right. So now we are on to the next question. How are you going to address compliance on demand? Is a PIA the same thing as a DPIA?
So first off, what is compliance on demand? Compliance on demand is that as a company, you need to be able to show that you're adhering to GDPR at any time. Meaning a regulator could show up on your company's doorstep and ask that they want to see your data inventory, Article 30. So you need to make sure that all your processing operations that are high risk have been documented in the data inventory. It also means that you need to be able to show a DPIA, a data protection impact assessment of your high-risk processing activities at any time. And so they need to be up to date. And how are you going to go about this? That is one. You're going to integrate privacy controls throughout your business. So you're going to build a good privacy risk management process that includes a PIA and a DPIA, meaning you need to make sure that you look at new initiatives and that you're looking at any kind of changes to initiatives you're having within your business and see what is the privacy risk in this. And when you hear PIA or DPIA, I often find people are very confused because PIA has been around so long in the US and, you know, it's being used with NIST. Government agencies are using these PIA. But a DPIA is not the same thing as a PIA. What differentiates the DPIA is really it's a risk assessment of the risk to the individual, meaning rather than the overall security and privacy risk that you see assessed in the PIA, this is really focused on the likelihood and the severity of the risk to the individual, and that would be discrimination, not getting a job, things really that would affect the individual. And when you think about high-risk processing, you want to understand more, the Working Party 29, a group that has been giving more information on that, just came out with a new procedure or new guidance on showing what high-risk processing is. That's one, profiling. So anytime you aggregate data and you create segments of a population, especially for targeted advertisement, that's considered high-risk processing. Also, if you have procedures that have automated decision-making, meaning maybe you profile individuals into their credit score, and maybe then you're saying, well, only people with excellent credit rating will be available for this credit card. And there's an automated decision-making process that targets different people. That's a high-risk processing activity. Also, when you have large sets of special category data, and take, for instance, background checks, you're doing that on all employees. So you may have a lot of sensitive data there that's going about previous convictions, data about children, so just quite a lot of data. Again, something you should evaluate whether that's high-risk processing. And then the other thing is also new technologies. And one of the new data elements that we're seeing that are being part of the special categories of data is biometric and genetic data. So you need to see that you really, through a good risk assessment process that goes first to an initial privacy risk assessment and then sees the one that needs a DPIA because there's high residual risk, That's what's driving your risk assessment, and that is what will help you be ready for compliance on demand. And one thing is, especially if you have multiple categories of these high-risk processing activities and you don't have the right controls in place, that's when you want to do a DPIA. And with the DPIA, one kind of thing that I want to encourage you is really use those as the top escalation of your privacy risk assessment process, meaning this should be the one that if you have still high residual risk that we say we're going to file with the regulator, but don't rename a PIA a DPIA, because if you think about it, these are the ones that on demand you have to show to a regulator, and you're going to have to ask for permission of processing. So really, you need to build this process in a very considered and very determined manner. So the DPIA is the most important risk assessment process for the EU, and it's really the top escalation. So how
All right. Thank you, Veronika, for that.
Yes, no, thank you both. Hey, yes, I would like to add just a couple of things. I thought that was extremely good, and I really like the idea Veronika said that you need to keep your terminology straight between PIA, excuse me, and DPIA. I do want to say that for profiling, for those companies who do profiles, I wanted to say that NIST has a very good methodology that they put out in a privacy publication last year that would help companies to find a good way to deal with that. And I believe that was in January 2017. And then a couple of thoughts on compliance on demand. So first of all, get internal audit involved, get IT audit involved. And obviously I'm preaching to the choir here, but that is important because they can play a good role in this. Secondly, look at your GRC tool. I think most every company would have one, and GRC tools have modules, and companies, RSA just recently put out an accelerator module on GDPR. They don't call it compliance on demand yet, but I'm sure they're going to be building into that. But then basically your GRC tool allows you to identify your risks and the controls and how you're meeting those controls. So if you can keep that up to date, that should show you where you are and should hopefully help in the compliance on demand process. And that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we are getting a ton of questions. So at the end, we'll get to them, but just keep them coming in, and hopefully we can get to quite a few at the end. So next up, what do we need to know to avoid the fines associated with the GDPR?
Okay, so the GDPR requires you to report breach within 72 hours after becoming aware of it. And we'll let Veronika talk about that a little bit more after I go through several things here. And that's whether or not you are a controller or the breach originates in one of your processors, your cloud provider, for example. So you've got to take a good, strong look at your contract and build your relationship with them so that when they get involved in an incident that could turn into a breach, you are aware of it immediately. That is critical time there. So a key thing to do is to establish an incident response plan with likely scenarios, controls, tabletop tests, and actual tests. So identify the scenarios that you would think likely that could happen in your company based upon your profile, your data, your customers, the way you do business, whether it's privacy or security, and plan for those scenarios. Put the controls in place you need to, and do some testing of your incident response plan. Get the right people involved. And then also, you can utilize your business impact assessments from disaster recovery to assess impact. And that's as you're going through the various phases of an incident response plan. As you're trying to narrow down and then choke off the problem, you can understand from your business impact assessments where the impact to the company is based upon what the incident is. And there's something called an OODA loop, Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, that I believe some companies are starting to build into their incident response plan, into their phases. So each part of the phase, you would observe, orient, decide, and act. This came from a fighter pilot, the U.S. Air Force, John Morgan, I believe, who developed this in combating an enemy. And this has actually evolved into a very good process, and it would help you, I believe. It does help companies in going through those phases and responding because you do have an enemy, the hacker. Document controls applied after each incident. So last year we had 2 large instances of ransomware, and a lot of companies were affected by that. And so if you ever get involved in a regulator coming in and looking at that, whether GDPR, whether perhaps HIPAA, could be the New York DFS cybersecurity regulation. You would want to make sure that you show that you did, show what you did, and that you responded, and to continue on documenting that, after you do your after action report. And some companies now are having a breach response plan in addition to the incident response plan. The incident response plan takes you up to the point where you say, okay, yes, this is a breach. You've confirmed it, or you're aware of it, and you need to report on that. But then the breach response plan would be compliance, would be legal, because they have done an analysis of your contracts. They know which state notification laws for your customers that you have to go back to in addition to everything else here. And they would have some tools in place, monitoring, et cetera, that would help on that. And then lastly, before I turn it over to Veronika, lastly, some companies are now getting a budget for breach response. I was at a conference, CIO portion, several weeks ago now, and I asked the question about 40 the CIOs in there, and 2 raised their hands in terms of having a budget. So it's saying, hey, we know this is a possibility, it's a risk, it's a reasonable risk, so we're putting in a budget for this, we're recognizing that this is possible. Veronika, do you have some other comments on this?
It's a great summary, Harvey, thank you. So really, I've just been reading the guidance from the Working Party 29 because I've been so much on, what does becoming aware mean? Or how about the 72 hours? Is that about notifying the individuals? Is that about notifying the regulators? So I want to give a little bit of background on that. So when does one become aware? The way they say it is when you have a reasonable degree of certainty that an incident has occurred. That, of course, depends on, what happened in this incident. So take, for instance, one of your employees has lost a USB key. The USB key had payroll data on there, and it's unencrypted. So when you become aware in this instance, you become aware when you know that this has been lost. So that's when you need to notify the regulator on this instance. And this doesn't mean that, they find it later on, withdraw, that you can't close this out, but you need to do as soon as you become aware of that. Also, a lot of incidents can happen when you have dealing with third parties, so they're handling your data. So let's say a third party has accidentally received data that it shouldn't, personal data. So when do you need to notify? That's when you have been informed by the third party. And then you have a short grace period to basically investigate. So saying, was it maybe data that was scheduled for another release that should have already happened, so they were supposed to have the data. So just kind of give me a little bit more background on this becoming aware. And then also, you have a breach, who do you report it to? So let's say it was just in Germany, for instance. You make sure that you let the National Supervisory Authority or the Supervisory Authority of the state that it's happened in know. But but let's say it's cross borders, multiple EU countries affected or gone to the US. That's when you let your lead authority know that this breach has happened. And so, what do you report to them? So, how are you going to go about it? And I want to kind of let you know there has just been a breach notification template. If you Google Luxembourg Data Protection Authority breach, they have come up with a template how to report a breach. And what's in there is, you basically want to let them know what's happened in the breach. So the categories of individuals affected, the approximate number, and then also, how many records were in there, as well as, who in your company is going to be the contact person who they can talk to about this. And then also having had a little assessment on the consequences of the personal data breach. Of course, these are all ones that are supposed to be having high risk for the individual. So if there is no high risk for the individual, there is no notification requirement. As well as anything you have done already to mitigate and contain the breach. And any kind of third parties that you've been working with. And the other thing that I want to add, and Javi, you've already gone great in that with the response plan, but it's really important that after you have concluded the breach, to have some lessons learned. And those lessons learned can also mean that you start looking at your data inventory again, and maybe you need to re-record some of the data that was found in the process. Maybe you have to revisit your risk assessment of a product after the breach. And the other way around, when you have a breach, you can use these tools to drive some of your action because you have everything integrated in there. And the more you integrate all these different deliverables, the more you make it basically a journey of where you link the tools, where you link the different skill sets of people working for privacy, the more effective your compliance will be, and the easier it will also be to administer it in the long run.
All right, thank you for such a thorough response to that one. So we are on to the last poll question. So the question is, on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being easy and 5 being most difficult, how difficult would complying with the 72-hour breach notification be for your organization? So polls open, and we'll wait a little bit for everybody to get their responses in. Okay, everybody finish responding here, and we'll see what the results are. Okay, let's close the poll. And it looks like people are hovering in right around 3 and 4, with more on the higher end of 5 than 1 or 2. Veronika, Harvey, anything you want to say about these responses?
I think this makes sense because it is a very difficult thing to do, and it seems like breach activity is increasing. It certainly isn't going away. And let me just add a quick thought about data retention. Data retention is also to get rid of the data you no longer need. And when you don't get rid of the data you no longer need, that is just more data that the hackers can play with, can get involved with. Veronika?
Veronika, have anything to add there, or shall we move to the next slide?
All right. So I was surprised by the results. So, almost 40% saying that it's, kind of average. I've been finding it hard to make sure that everyone is trained in the organization to to become aware of breaches that have happened quickly. I've also found it hard to make sure that, assessing which ones are the high-risk processing activities that would mean there's notification requirements. And so, just really urge people to revisit their breach protocol and start looking and maybe even having a tabletop exercise to take one of these scenarios and say, how would that be, even who to contact is an issue. So tabletop exercise to really play this through and see whether that can be done within 72 hours.
Okay, great. So we are now on to the last little bit of the content of our webinar here. So we're going to wrap up with 5 steps to take now to mitigate risk. Is it too late to get started? What does GDPR compliance really entail? If I'm behind schedule, how much of the GDPR do I have to do?
So this is 5 steps to take now. So you really want to prioritize where you get started. And one of the key things that's really a core of the GDPR requirements is having a really good understanding of your data. So making sure that your processes are being documented, and you make sure you know where is it being stored. So it's like physically, but also in what countries, who you're sharing this data with. And the data inventory really gives you a very good overview and starts driving some other requirements. So when you know what data is being collected, are you giving adequate notice at that point? Maybe you have actually a third party collect the data on your behalf. Are they giving adequate notice? Then looking in, is it very transparent and show what you're really doing? Also, do you have retention policies? Are the retention policies matching and being mapped to the data inventory? Do you have the right physical and information security and also organizational security controls in place? So the data inventory is really, to me, the heart of GDPR, the heart where you really get a good understanding of how are you handling the data. And it's also the area where you can start driving and identifying the risks and building controls into the processes. Because the bottom line is you can have a really good privacy program, but unless it's integrated in people dealing with the data, whether it's your HR people, your product development people, and they're adhering to it, and you have it documented, it's really tough complying with the other requirements. The other thing that a data inventory is helpful in is, you've seen in the regulation, it's all, are you the controller, are you the processor, helping you understand at that level what your role is. So you'll start seeing who's collecting the data, you start also seeing what the decision making is happening on it. So having it documented in the data inventory can also help you identify that, as well as, cross-border data transfer mechanisms on legal basis. So it's a good tool to start driving all the other related requirements. The next thing that really is important, and that's really what GDPR is trying to drive to, is having accountability in the organization. So really looking in your data subject rights. So do you give people the right to be forgotten? Do you have to make data available as a data portability, so in machine-readable format? And the other thing also, that I've seen efforts actually regulators looking at notices, meaning any externally facing privacy notice, is that compliant with GDPR? So GDPR is driving new requirements on making sure you have a contact information on there. You have your retention integrated in there, and requirements that need to be shown in your notice. So really having people there who are doing that. And then, of course, as Harvey mentioned before, your internal audit, that's your eyes and ears to make sure you're compliant. If a regulator can come in any day and look at it, you better have an audit program that has a GDPR compliant script that can test this and can make sure that you're ready. And then also, I know it's not required for everyone, but appointing someone in charge of data privacy, especially a data protection officer, that really helps drive accountability. And when you're making these decisions, you really want to look, do you have some kind of high-risk processing? Maybe you're a small company, but you're monitoring individuals via your website. Do you maybe have more than 250 employees in the EU? And then also really thinking about, what makes sense for us. Do we have someone in-house fill this role, or do we, outsource that as a role? Because there's a lot of flexibility with these models, and you really have to see what works for you.
Okay, the next one is speech management protocol. I'm going to be pretty brief here. You definitely need to have a compliant breach management protocol. This is going to be critical, and you need to ensure that the right areas of the company are involved every time. Privacy, IT security, cybersecurity, compliance, legal, and the business unit. We need to get them involved as well. That's it, and the best of fortune in this area.
So we've mentioned this a little bit before, but you need to make sure that your third parties are also compliant with GDPR. The best way you can do that is really partner with your technology and service providers. Understand, where are they in the journey, and will they be compliant by May? And then also really make sure that you're reviewing your contracts. So do you have privacy and security clauses in there? Because, if it's a data processor for you, you want to have a data processing agreement and define who is doing what. And also, we've learned about breaches. You need to collaborate closely on this together. So having an open communication on that is important.
And lastly, engage your employees. Make sure senior management is engaged and communicates the urgency to all employees. Set the tone at the top. That's absolutely critical for that involvement, because leadership will get you the resources that you need to get this finished. And then establish cross-functional teams and privacy champions and security champions to address the challenges. That is also absolutely key, and it's going to be an ongoing challenge as you continue to get to compliance on demand. Erin, back to you for questions.
All right. Well, thank you, guys. I think everybody definitely benefited from your guys' expertise here. So now we are on to questions. Like I said, we got a ton of questions, so we'll try to get to as many as we can here before our time is up. So first question for Veronika and Harvey. Can the CISO role interchange with the DPO role?
My first thought is not. I think they should be kept separate and help each other out in various areas. But Veronika, what do you think about that?
Well, there's a little bit of a conflict of interest there. So, I agree with you, Harvey. I think those should be two separate roles and should be kept that way, simply because some of the security is also known as monitoring. So, you need to make pretty decisions that can be security focused from the CISO role, and you need to make independent privacy decisions from the DPO or privacy professional role. And Erin, I found a few questions that I would like to see whether I can ask those on behalf of the individuals.
Go for it. Yeah, definitely.
So one that it really intrigued me was, how do you see GDPR affecting companies operating only in North America? Because that's, I've been seeing people ask that, and what I'm really seeing happening is they are often third-party providers for other companies that are operating in the EU. So that's driving some of the compliance requirements in companies that the small and medium-sized businesses that I was mentioning previously that would have not before been in the scope of GDPR, that are now working towards becoming compliant with GDPR. So I see a lot more maturing of privacy throughout all types of businesses that weren't previously in scope, and I think that's a good thing. And also, overhearing the regulators in Europe, heard that they're in close communications now with South Korea, Israel, and some of the other Asian countries on, cross-border data transfers, and also they're reviewing whether they want to update their regulation. So I think just being in North America, as much as companies are working either with multinationals or offering multinationals, there's going to be a lot more privacy compliance regulation coming out in the next few years.
And this is Harvey. I want to jump. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just jump in on something here. There was a question. Somebody said, "Hey, great course. I've done the checkpoints. I've only been able to do 2 out of 5." Well, I want to take responsibility for that and say that I killed the checkpoint process. So I apologize, and hopefully Lucy's going to be able to handle that well. So I just wanted to jump in with that. Thank you, Aaron.
All right.
One that I continue hearing, Aaron, is does GDPR right to be forgotten supersede with data retention requirements or other kind of retention requirements? Because it becomes a real, you have our global retention policies, whether it's just your regular retention or maybe data that's under legal hold or so on. Do you have to delete all that? And the answer is no. Right to be forgotten is really data that's no longer needed for processing. And there's also the exceptions, let's say there's an investigation going on. That data needs to be kept. Don't take the right to be forgotten as an absolute. Just as data you no longer need for processing, let's say maybe you had a candidate for a position, you selected someone else. You probably don't need that data. Forgetting that data is a good scenario.
Okay, thanks, Veronika. I know you're the expert here, so seeing some questions that you wanted to answer, definitely okay. Here's one here. How does the requirement to be GDPR compliant supersede the Privacy Shield framework? Can you help me understand that relationship in terms of the EU-US Privacy Shield?
Let me jump in on this one. Privacy Shield is, I think, doing a very good job now providing the controls necessary for the onward transfer of data. Plus, it's also got you into GDPR a little bit early if you got in on it early. And it had the advantage of being able to join and then get your contracts in line later, which are key. I think going forward, I think it is going to be challenged by the EUCJ, but I really believe it's going to prevail. And at some point, my guess, and it's a guess, is a couple of 2 or 3 years in the future, it'll just either be rolled into GDPR or just figured it doesn't need to continue. So that's my thought. Veronika, any thoughts on that?
Being German, I'm thinking there's going to be a lot of challenge with Privacy Shield from especially Germans, and I think it's not all said and done with Privacy Shield. So if I would focus on one framework, I would focus on GDPR. And I agree with your summary, it has the broader controls.
All right, so we are right at the end of the webinar here, so I am going to pass back to Lucy, and she will close everything out. Thanks for all the great questions.
Thank you so much, Erin. I truly appreciate that. Again, everyone, thank you for your participation today. I'd like to thank Veronika, Harvey, and Erin for that great presentation, great moderation, and interesting Q&A session. Also, a big thanks to our sponsor, MediaPro, whose support has made it possible for ISACA to offer this event free of charge to our constituents.